Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. I've been driving trucks for over 20 years and have seen many strange things on the road. Suspicious people, mysterious stops, places that just make you feel uncomfortable. But nothing has ever disturbed me as much as what happened one winter night in 2016. I was transporting cargo from Chicago to Portland, and since I was behind schedule, I decided to stop and rest at a truck stop somewhere on the Idaho border. I had stopped there before. The place wasn't the worst, but it always made me uneasy. My dog Baxter, who had accompanied me for years on trips, was sitting in the passenger seat, sniffing the air when I parked. Usually he would curl up and fall asleep, but that night he was alert, with his ears perked up. I should have taken this as a warning. The parking lot was half empty. A few trucks with their engines running in the cold night, but something seemed wrong. It was too quiet for a truck stop. No conversations, no rumbling engines, no music from nearby vehicles. Just the humming of street lights and the whistling of distant wind from the surrounding mountains. As soon as I stepped out of the truck, I immediately felt a tingling on the back of my neck, as if I was being watched. I looked around, but saw nothing except rows of trucks and the faint flicker of a neon sign in the distance. Through the windshield, I could see my dog intently watching me, his gaze constantly shifting between me and something in the darkness behind my back. I tried to ignore the feeling, grabbed my wallet, patted Baxter, and told him I'd be back soon. He followed me with his eyes as I locked the doors, and he was clearly unhappy about it. When I entered the diner, I was greeted by the smell of burnt coffee and fried food. The place was almost empty. A tired waitress stood behind the counter, and an older man sat in the corner, hunched over a plate of something unappealing. Unlike most roadside diners, there was no television, no other patrons, not even the usual noise from the kitchen. I chose a seat by the window where I could see my truck and ordered something simple. The waitress nodded without even looking at me. The silence was almost absolute, interrupted only by the soft sound of a radio playing some old song that I couldn't recognize, though the melody seemed strangely familiar. I sat there for a while until I decided to go to the bathroom. I wasn't there for more than 5 minutes, but when I returned, everything seemed exactly the same, except for one detail. My coffee cup had changed position. Not by much, just a few inches to the left, and it was now sitting on a different napkin. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe the waitress had come to clean the table. But my plate was untouched, and I hadn't heard anyone approach. Chills ran down my spine. I looked around. The man in the corner was still there, head bowed. The waitress was writing something behind the counter. There was no one else. I tried to ignore the feeling and quickly finished my meal, but I couldn't stop looking around. That discomfort wouldn't leave me. I examined my food, looked for anything suspicious, but found nothing. Everything looked normal, but the taste of the coffee seemed strange, bitter, with a metallic aftertaste that I hadn't noticed before. I paid the bill and returned to the truck. As I approached, I saw that my dog was restless. pacing back and forth in the cab and quietly whimpering. "Easy boy," I muttered, unlocking the doors. But before getting in, my gaze shifted to the darkness beyond the parking lot, toward the line of trees. That's when I saw someone, a silhouette, almost invisible in the half-darkness, standing right at the edge of the forest. It was too far away to make out any details, but close enough for me to know it was watching me. I froze with my hand on the door handle. The figure didn't move, didn't approach or retreat, just stood there motionless, as if wanting me to know about its presence. Baxter began to growl quietly, his fur bristling. And then something happened that I didn't expect. The figure raised its hand and waved at me. A simple gesture, but in the context of the situation, it seemed incredibly sinister. I quickly climbed into the cab and locked the doors. When I started the engine, my headlights momentarily illuminated the edge of the forest, but the silhouette was gone. I couldn't sleep that night. I constantly checked the mirrors and looked at the clock every minute. When morning finally came, I still felt strange. I was plagued by mild nausea, and there was an unusual haziness in my head, as if I hadn't slept or had drunk too much of something strong. I thought about telling someone, but what would I say? That a man stood in the forest watching me. That my coffee cup had been moved. It would sound like paranoia. Instead, I went into the gas station to get some fresh coffee. On impulse, I asked the cashier if he had heard anything about that place. He was an older man with a face marked by time and weather, as if carved from wood kissed by the sun. He sighed and scratched his chin before answering. From time to time, truckers say they see someone hanging around, messing with the trucks. The police never find anything. Chills ran down my spine. I told him about my displaced cup and the figure in the forest. The man showed no surprise. He just looked at me and asked, "Did you check your food and drinks?" My stomach turned. I asked what he meant. He sighed again. 16 years ago, there was this guy who put things in customers' food. Drugs, tranquilizers, experimental substances he made himself. He was never caught, but after the police started investigating, the reports stopped. Until the last few months, a bitter taste filled my mouth. My food had seemed normal, but that morning I felt dizzy. And that metallic taste in the coffee. The people he chose, the cashier continued, lowering his voice. They all reported the same thing, a figure watching them from the forest. Some said it waved to them. A wave of panic washed over me. And what? What happened to those people? The man shrugged. Most just drove on, felt sick for a day or two. But a few, they started seeing things, hearing voices. One guy was convinced he was being followed. Didn't stop for weeks. Crashed into a tree near Spokane. I returned to the truck, feeling tremors. Baxter was still restless, looking toward the forest. I started the engine and drove out of there as fast as I could. On the way to Portland, I kept checking the rearview mirrors. Several times I thought I saw a familiar figure on the roadside, but when I looked closely, there was no one there. Hallucination, paranoia, or was there really something in my coffee? I never stopped at that place again, but sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I feel a strange tingling on the back of my neck, as if someone is watching me from the roadside. And in such moments, I see Baxter tense up, his eyes fixed on something in the darkness that I can't notice. And I just keep driving, pressing the gas a little harder, as if speed could save me from whatever might be following me since that night. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Jack, and I've been a delivery driver for the past 12 years, mostly covering overnight routes through the mountain highways of Colorado. When you spend that much time on empty roads in the dead of night, you're bound to experience some strange encounters. Lone hitchhikers appearing out of nowhere, unexplained lights in distant valleys, even the occasional wildlife crossing that makes your heart stop. But nothing compares to what happened during one of my trips about 3 years ago, in the middle of November. I was driving along Highway 67, a long and desolate stretch that winds through dense forest and past abandoned mining towns. After sunset, that route becomes a different world entirely. You can drive for dozens of miles without seeing another vehicle, just your headlights cutting through the darkness and the occasional glimpse of yellow eyes reflecting back from the tree line. That night, it was around 3 a.m, and I was staying alert by listening to a late-night talk radio show about conspiracy theories, something to keep my mind engaged on the empty road. The highway stretched out before me, completely deserted. No cars ahead, no headlights in my mirrors. Just me and the endless ribbon of asphalt. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, a car appeared behind me. It was a silver sedan, maybe a Lexus or an Audi, and it was approaching at alarming speed. I remember thinking the driver must be drunk or racing to some emergency. The car weaved slightly as it got closer, then steadied itself in the left lane to pass me. That's when I saw her, the woman in the passenger seat. Her face was unnaturally pale, almost luminescent under the glow of the dashboard lights. Her eyes were wide open, fixed on mine without blinking as the car glided alongside mine. Her mouth was slightly parted, as if she was trying to speak, but couldn't form the words. I glanced at the driver, but could only make out a dark silhouette gripping the steering wheel with both hands. Then, in an instant, the car accelerated and vanished into the darkness ahead. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Strange things happen on the road at night. People drive erratically. Passengers do weird things. I told myself she was probably just tired, maybe even messing around. But something about her face stayed with me. It wasn't just fear in her expression. It was something deeper, like she was desperately trying to communicate a warning. I continued driving, attempting to shake off the uncomfortable feeling. Maybe 20 minutes passed when I again saw headlights in my rearview mirror. The same silver sedan passed me in exactly the same manner. But this time, the woman's face was different, still frozen in fear. But her mouth was open wider, as if she was silently screaming. And just like before, the car accelerated and disappeared into the night. At that moment, I was fully awake, my hands clenching the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. There was no way I had imagined this twice. I slowed down and scanned the road ahead, expecting to see the car stopped or perhaps crashed in a ditch. Nothing. Another 25 minutes went by. The radio had turned to static. which I realized I'd been listening to without noticing. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see those headlights again, but the road remained empty. Just when I was beginning to convince myself it was all over, the headlights reappeared. This time, the sedan didn't pass me. It stayed back, just close enough for me to barely make out its shape through the darkness. I couldn't ignore this anymore. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? I felt ridiculous saying it, but I explained what was happening. A silver sedan had passed me twice with the same terrified woman in the passenger seat, and now it appeared to be following me. The dispatcher remained calm and asked for my location, which I provided. Sir, we have no reports of any vehicle matching that description on your route tonight. That didn't mean much in such a remote area, but it unsettled me nonetheless. She instructed me to continue driving to the next town, where an officer would be waiting. I thanked her, hung up, and glanced in the mirror again. The car was gone. It hadn't pulled over or slowed down. It had simply vanished. I continued driving, checking my mirrors every few seconds for the next several miles. Nothing. When I reached a gas station in a small town called Pine Ridge, I pulled over to catch my breath. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a single trucker refueling his rig. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke from nearby cabins. It seemed safe. I called dispatch again and informed them I was taking a short break. Then, out of paranoia, I asked the station attendant if he'd seen a silver sedan pass by recently. He thought for a moment, then shook his head. Not in the last 4 or 5 hours, no. I didn't respond, just nodded. I paid for my coffee and returned to my truck. I completed my route without further incidents, but throughout the journey, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the vehicle, as if someone was watching me from just outside my peripheral vision. The next morning, I searched for news about a missing woman or an accident along Highway 67. Nothing, not a single report. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was a trick of exhaustion. Maybe a bizarre coincidence of a car passing me twice with a scared passenger. But a part of me, a significant part, believes that woman was trying to tell me something. And I simply drove on, never discovering what it was. The worst experience I ever had happened in 2008, when I was working as part of a 2-person driving team. We picked up our cargo in Seattle during a fierce winter storm and hit the road heading east through the Cascades. I opted to take the first shift and drove through the night under relentless, freezing rain that occasionally turned to snow at higher elevations. After approximately 11 hours behind the wheel, we stopped at a rest area to switch places and update our logbooks. I was completely drained. Before going to sleep, my partner, I'll call him Marcus, made a joke I've never forgotten. With a half smile on his face, he said, "If we die tonight, I'm coming back to haunt you." Then he closed the sleeper cabin curtain and took over driving. After the switch, I did the same, closed the curtain and put on my headphones to help me relax while trying to fall asleep. An intrusive thought kept bothering me. What would I do if we lost control and plummeted off one of the mountain passes? The best option seemed to be to brace myself and pray. About an hour later, I was jolted awake by Marcus shouting, "Hold on." I felt the truck swerve violently. Something was terribly wrong. He shouted again, and instinctively I threw myself to the floor, praying we weren't heading toward a cliff edge. Suddenly, there was a tremendous impact. The entire truck shuddered, but strangely, we didn't lose momentum. The vehicle, weighing nearly 80,000 pounds, slid on the icy pavement, crossed the median, and entered the oncoming lane. Before I could fully comprehend the gravity of the situation, we collided head-on with another vehicle. Our truck spun around and came to a stop facing the opposite direction. The silence that followed was horrifying. Still in shock, I heard Marcus ask if I was okay. I said yes, and told him we needed to get out immediately. The smell of smoke and diesel filled the air. We climbed out of the cab with difficulty. I was barefoot, stepping onto freezing asphalt mixed with fuel, while trying to understand what had happened. I saw people running toward a white pickup truck we had hit, carrying fire extinguishers. Everything seemed like a nightmare. When I fully regained awareness of the moment, I noticed my hand and mouth were bleeding. The fire was quickly controlled, but the scene that followed was even more devastating. Shortly after, I was placed in an ambulance. As I looked through the rear window, I began to cry uncontrollably. I couldn't stop imagining the terror those people in the other vehicle must have felt seeing a massive truck careening toward them out of control. At the hospital, I received the worst news of my life. I've been a long-haul trucker since I was 22 years old. Throughout my career, I've driven countless miles during the night shift, and naturally, I've experienced some bizarre things along the way. I used to make deliveries for several different companies, often crossing through multiple states to complete my routes. One particular evening, in late autumn of '97, I needed to transport a shipment of specialized medical equipment across the Appalachian Mountains. Much of the journey wound through isolated mountain roads, cutting through dense forests with hardly any signs of civilization. The trip was estimated to take several hours, and I had already fallen behind schedule before even starting out. I knew most of my driving would be in darkness. The mountain roads were treacherous at night, but they were also empty, which allowed me to drive a bit faster than usual. As I rounded a sharp curve, my headlights caught the reflection of hazard lights blinking ahead. I had to slam on my brakes hard, feeling the weight of the truck strain against the sudden deceleration. As I carefully pulled over behind a vehicle parked on the narrow shoulder next to a steep drop-off. It was one of those vintage muscle cars from the '70s, a Pontiac Firebird with its hazard lights flashing rhythmically. I climbed down from my cab because I wanted to check if someone needed help. I walked up to the car and knocked on the driver's window. No response. I bent down slightly to peer through the tinted windows, but couldn't see anyone sitting inside. I checked all the windows and confirmed the car was empty. Then I surveyed the dark, misty forest surrounding us. The fog was so thick, I couldn't see more than 40 feet ahead of me. I was feeling particularly compassionate that night and genuinely wanted to help. So I returned to my truck and grabbed a flashlight from the toolbox beneath the passenger seat. It was one of those tactical flashlights, with a beam so powerful it could temporarily blind you if you looked directly into it. As soon as I switched on the flashlight, its beam revealed what appeared to be an old diner set back from the road. Somehow I hadn't noticed it before, perhaps because the parking lot was overgrown with weeds and saplings, blending seamlessly with the forest. I could barely make out the cracked asphalt beneath the carpet of fallen leaves. The abandoned structure was weathered and decrepit, with a faded neon sign that must have once beckoned travelers to stop for a hot meal. In that moment, it made sense to me that the owner of the Firebird with flashing hazards was probably somewhere inside the diner. I approached the front entrance, where the door hung precariously from a single hinge. My flashlight illuminated the interior, confirming my suspicions. This had indeed been a classic roadside diner, complete with a long counter, swivel stools, and torn vinyl booths lining the windows. It wasn't surprising that such an establishment hadn't survived on this remote mountain pass, with so little traffic. I called out, asking if anyone was there, announcing that I was willing to help. My voice echoed slightly in the empty space, sending a chill down my spine. Then I heard something from the far end of the diner, a sound like leather shoes scuffing against the linoleum floor. The noise was coming from behind what used to be the serving counter, where plates of hot food would have once been passed from kitchen to wait staff. I called out again, offering assistance if needed. That's when I heard a deep, raspy whisper that said, "Leave this place." I clearly understood the words, but couldn't fathom why this person would say that. I also heard heavy, labored breathing coming from one of the corners. That was enough to send me hurrying back toward my truck. Just as I reached the door, I heard another sound that froze my blood. A woman's muffled scream from inside the diner. I was completely disoriented for several seconds, uncertain if what I'd heard was real. There was something unnatural about the sounds. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I sprinted to my truck and called the police because, truthfully, I was too frightened to go back inside. The dispatcher asked for my exact location, but all I could say was that I was beside an abandoned diner on a mountain road somewhere between Oak Ridge and Pinecrest. They asked me to stay on the line so I could provide more details about my location. Suddenly, the Firebird in front of me roared to life and accelerated away, tires squealing on the wet pavement. I was so disoriented that I hadn't even noticed when someone got into the car. It was dark, and I was distracted by the phone call. I ran back to the diner to see if anyone else was still there, keeping the police on the line. I went to the back area, where I'd heard the voice and breathing. I froze when I saw a puddle of fresh blood on the floor, and what looked like drag marks leading toward the kitchen. I could only imagine the gruesome details of what had happened there. I told the dispatcher that I had likely just witnessed a crime. Eventually, the police sent several patrol cars to the location. They questioned me about any information that might be useful, the car's license plate, the suspect's appearance, and so on. All I could tell them was that the car was an older model Firebird, dark in color, possibly burgundy or black in the dim light, and that I'd heard a male voice telling me to leave, followed by a woman screaming as I was exiting. There was no body left behind, but I had my theories about what had happened. The police collected evidence and blood samples, but I couldn't contribute much more to the investigation. Unfortunately, I didn't have a dash cam in my truck that would have captured the license plate, but I ordered and installed one the very next week. This was certainly one of those rare, once-in-a-lifetime experiences that will haunt me for years to come. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, hearing that whisper telling me to leave, and wondering what would have happened if I had stayed. What troubles me most isn't the blood I found, or even the scream I heard. It's that when the police ran tests on the blood samples, they told me the blood wasn't human. And according to local records, that diner had burned down in a devastating fire more than 30 years ago, with all the patrons still inside. I've been working as a long-haul trucker for different companies for over 15 years now. About 5 years ago, I was making deliveries for a distribution company based out of northern Montana. I was driving an 18-wheeler with a full trailer load, heading through the winding mountain passes that cut through the Rockies. It was June 23rd, a muggy Wednesday night. Summer had just begun, but in the mountains, the night still carried a biting chill. I had a tight deadline with several shipments that needed to be delivered before the weekend hit. So I was pushing myself to cover as much ground as possible. I started my drive around 5 in the afternoon, planning to reach my destination that same night. I really didn't want to make an overnight stop if I could help it. These mountain roads were lonely enough during the day. Sometime after 3 in the morning, I found myself pushing 15 miles over the speed limit, which is dangerously fast for a fully loaded semi on those twisting roads. I was getting exhausted, but I was only about 40 minutes from my destination and convinced myself I could make it without stopping. My eyelids were growing heavier by the minute, making it a struggle to keep them open. I splashed some coffee from my thermos onto my fingers and rubbed it on my face, which helped wake me up just enough to keep going. My truck was the only vehicle on that stretch of highway at that hour. Nothing but the cone of my headlights cutting through the absolute darkness of the wilderness. I remember it with perfect clarity. I was reaching for my thermos for another swig when I nearly choked, slamming on the brakes as I spotted a dark figure in the road up ahead, rapidly coming into view as my high beams caught it. As the truck decelerated, almost coming to a complete stop, I got a better look at this person standing almost in the center of the highway. The figure appeared to be wearing some kind of charcoal gray coat, with an unusually large collar wrapped around their neck. What struck me most was the person's neck. It was disturbingly long, stretched in a way that seemed almost inhuman. I know that's a strange detail to fixate on, but it was so elongated that it was genuinely unsettling. The face was completely blurred, like looking through frosted glass. I couldn't make out a single feature. As my truck slowed and approached this mysterious stranger, I was about to lower my window to ask if they needed help, but they suddenly pivoted to their left and sprinted toward the dense pine forest at the edge of the road. In that moment, I didn't think too deeply about how strange the encounter was. I just hit the gas and continued on my way, eager to finish my route. To be honest, it was about 30 seconds later when my heart really started pounding. That's when the reality of how bizarre that situation had been truly hit me. About 10 minutes passed, and I was starting to calm down when suddenly something else happened. While cruising at high speed again, I spotted something moving on the road ahead. At first, I thought it was a deer or an elk, but as I got closer and the thing darted into the tree line, I realized it looked human-shaped. I didn't even touch the brakes this time. I just maintained my speed and kept going. I continued down the highway and even pressed the accelerator a bit harder, as I was becoming increasingly uneasy and wanted to reach my destination faster. But my fatigue was getting worse, and a few times I drifted into the oncoming lane without realizing it. With about 30 minutes of driving left, I wasn't sure if I could safely complete the journey. I began looking for somewhere suitable to pull over, and eventually spotted a small gravel turnout beside the highway, one of those designated rest areas for tired drivers. I guided my rig into the space, set the parking brake, reclined my seat, and closed my eyes. I couldn't have slept for more than 45 minutes before suddenly jolting awake in the pitch darkness. I still can't pinpoint exactly what woke me, but the moment my eyes opened, something inside me was screaming to turn on the lights. I switched on the headlights, and they illuminated the area in front of my truck. There was someone, standing directly in front of my vehicle. It was the same figure with the strange collar I'd spotted in the middle of the highway. But now, I could see the face more clearly. They had an impossibly wide smile that stretched far beyond normal human proportions, and their eyes were opened as wide as physically possible. They stared directly at me through the windshield. With my heart nearly exploding out of my chest, I started the engine and peeled out of that gravel turnout as fast as my rig would allow. I couldn't make sense of it. How could this person have traveled 15 miles from where I'd first seen them? It wasn't possible unless they had a vehicle, but I hadn't seen any other cars on the road. I didn't stop again that night until I reached my destination. When I arrived, I fell asleep in the parking lot and woke up early the following morning, as the sun was just beginning to crest over the eastern mountains. Upon waking, the only logical explanation I could come up with was that my exhausted mind had played tricks on me. I'd seen several strange things that night, but I'd never heard that fatigue-induced hallucinations could be so vivid and terrifying. I've never experienced anything like it since, and the fact that it seemed so real is what continues to haunt me to this day. Sometimes when I'm driving those same mountain passes at night, I find myself scanning the tree line, wondering if that figure with the impossibly long neck and stretched smile is watching from somewhere in the darkness, waiting for another chance to appear in front of my headlights. What troubles me most is the question that keeps me awake on those long night drives. What would have happened if I had actually stopped and gotten out of my truck? Before landing my cushy office job in Austin, I worked as a delivery driver for a small shipping company in rural Nevada. The pay was decent, and I mostly enjoyed the work, but there were definitely some moments that made me question my career choices. It was the fall of 2008, about 3 years after I dropped out of college. I was working the late shift, from 4 in the afternoon until midnight on a Friday. We were in that strange part of autumn where the days grow shorter faster than you expect, and darkness had already settled in by 7 o'clock. I wasn't working in some fancy suburb or bustling downtown area. I was covering routes in forgotten towns scattered across the desert, places that never quite made it onto tourist maps, but weren't completely abandoned either. The area wasn't exactly dangerous, but it wasn't somewhere you'd want your car to break down after dark. I made deliveries to these areas regularly. The housing situation was peculiar. You'd have stretches of road with weathered mobile homes and small ranch houses spaced far apart. Then entire sections with nothing but empty lots and abandoned foundations. It made for inefficient delivery runs, since the houses were so spread out that each stop took longer than it should have. Each day's deliveries were mapped out strategically, so I could take the most efficient route rather than zigzagging across town in some random pattern. The company was big on efficiency, but there was only so much you could do with such scattered addresses. After countless hours of deliveries that day, driving through 3 different small towns dropping off packages, I turned down a road in one of those sparsely populated areas I mentioned earlier. On one side stood occasional trailers and small houses set far back from the road. On the other side was nothing but scrubland dotted with Joshua trees that cast eerie shadows in my headlights. It was around 9:30, and my shift was winding down with just a few deliveries left. There was an isolated trailer at the end of this road, and the package required a signature, which meant I couldn't just leave it on the porch and drive away. I pulled up in front of the place, went to the back of my truck, and grabbed what was easily the heaviest box of the day. Whatever was inside clinked and shifted like metal parts, dozens of them, sliding against each other. I couldn't begin to guess what it contained, but my job was just to get it signed for and delivered. The trailer had no doorbell, so I had to knock. I didn't see any lights on inside, and there was no car in what passed for a driveway, so I wasn't optimistic about anyone being home. I knocked firmly a few times, then noticed a curtain move slightly in one of the windows. I heard footsteps approaching the door, followed by a long pause, an unsettlingly long pause before it finally opened. An older woman poked her head out cautiously, her expression somewhere between suspicious and anxious. When I explained she had a package that needed her signature, she finally opened the door completely. She seemed fidgety as I asked her to sign on my electronic pad. Her signature was just a hasty scrawl. She then told me I would need to help carry the box to her back room. I'd been half expecting this request, given how frail she appeared and how heavy the package was. The moment I stepped inside that trailer, I was hit with a powerful stench. Every home has its own distinct smell, good or bad, but this one was particularly foul. I couldn't pinpoint what was causing it. She led me through a cluttered living area toward the back of the trailer. She guided me down a narrow hallway where I struggled to maneuver the bulky box, then stopped at a door. She opened it and told me to place the package in the closet at the far end of the room. I asked her to turn on the light, but she claimed it was broken. The room was almost completely dark, with the only illumination coming from the living room light filtering down the hallway. I could barely see enough to navigate safely. I entered cautiously, straining my eyes to adjust to the darkness. I was halfway across the room, approaching the closet, when in the shadows I made out a human figure standing in the corner of the closet. I was certain it was a person. I could make out the distinctive silhouette, and I saw movement as they shifted position. There was no logical explanation. This person was clearly hiding, waiting for me to come closer. With adrenaline surging through my body, I quickly set the box on the floor and started backing out of the room. I hurried past the woman and muttered something like, "Have a good night." She started shouting for me to come back and help her, even calling me some choice names that I won't repeat. I don't know what that woman and the person hiding in the closet had planned, and I didn't stick around to find out. I finished my shift that night, drove straight home, and by sunrise the next morning, I was already updating my resume and searching for a safer job, preferably one that didn't involve entering strangers' homes after dark. 2 weeks later, I saw a news report about an assault on a pizza delivery driver in the same area. They described a similar setup, and although they didn't give the exact address, I knew in my gut it was the same place. Sometimes I still wonder what was actually in that heavy box I delivered, and what might have happened if I hadn't noticed that figure lurking in the darkness. I've been working in an office for 7 years now, and I've never once regretted leaving that delivery job behind. Some nights, though, I still wake up thinking about that closet and what was waiting inside. My name is Mike, and I want to share with you a chilling story that happened to me during a long haul through the Appalachians. I've been a long-haul truck driver for 15 years and have seen a lot on America's roads. That night, my partner Jason was with me. We often travel together on long distances. That way, we can split the hours behind the wheel, making these endless journeys more bearable. It was late fall November, when days grow shorter and nights colder. We were driving on a mountain road in West Virginia. It was around 11 at night, heavy rain drumming on the cab's roof, and visibility was terrible. The truck's headlights barely penetrated the curtain of rain and thick fog that hung over the road. We were passing through one of those winding mountain passes when we noticed flashing lights ahead. I slowed down and we saw absolute chaos. Several ambulances, police cars with their lights flashing, rescue workers in bright vests bustling around. It looked like a tour bus had lost control on the slippery road and overturned, flying off the shoulder. I kept my eyes straight ahead, trying not to look at the accident scene. I always avoid such scenes. They stay in your memory for a long time and haunt your dreams. But Jason, on the contrary, couldn't look away. He stared out the window, watching as rescuers worked with victims, as some lay covered on the ground. I heard him quietly muttering a prayer. When we finally drove past the accident site, the atmosphere in the cab became oppressive. The rain intensified, turning into a genuine downpour. Usually, Jason and I talk a lot about family, sports, politics, anything to stay awake. But that evening, we were both silent. I felt a heavy energy, as if something dark and cold had crept into our cab along with us. God, what a nightmare! Jason finally broke the silence. I counted at least 7 bodies. Seems like it was a school trip or something. There were children. I didn't want to discuss it and just nodded. We continued driving in silence. About half an hour after the accident, Jason fell asleep, leaning his head against the window. I was left alone with the road, the rain, and my thoughts. 45 minutes after passing the disaster site, I noticed something ahead on the road. At first, I thought it might be wildlife, maybe a deer. But when the beam of the headlights caught the figure, I realized it was a person waving their arms, trying to stop passing vehicles. I automatically began to brake. We were on a deserted stretch of highway, without any houses nearby, and the temperature had dropped to almost 0. You can't leave someone in such conditions in the middle of the night, especially in such rain. As the distance between us shortened, I could see it was a young woman, possibly college-aged. She was dressed in what once was a white blouse and dark skirt, but now her clothes were dirty, torn, and soaked through. Her dark hair clung to her face and her eyes. Even from a distance, there was something strange about her gaze. I woke Jason up and told him I was going to pick up a girl who seemed to be in trouble. He drowsily nodded and straightened in his seat, rubbing his eyes. I had almost stopped, and now I could see the girl clearly. She stood motionless in the pouring rain, not trying to take shelter or protect herself from the weather, just staring directly at us. Her face was pale, with dark circles under her eyes, and a large bruise visible on her cheek. That's when Jason, who had finally gotten a good look at the figure on the road, grabbed my arm with such force that it hurt. "Don't stop, Mike. Keep driving." Faster, his voice sounded panicked. "What? Are you crazy? We can't leave her here," I protested, still keeping my foot on the brake. "That girl, she was there at the accident site. I saw her, Mike. I swear to you, she was among the dead. I definitely remember her face, that blouse. They covered her body with a black bag as we drove by." The moment these words were spoken, something changed in the girl's gaze. She stared directly at us, but now her eyes were completely black without whites. Her head slowly tilted to the side at an unnatural angle, and she smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. Her mouth stretched too wide, revealing too many teeth. Cold horror pierced me to the bone. I pressed the gas so hard that our 18-wheeler monster lurched forward, nearly veering off the road. As we rushed past her, I involuntarily glanced in the side mirror and saw that she had turned to watch us leave. She didn't move, didn't try to chase us, just stood in the downpour, watching as we drove away. And the strangest thing, the rain was falling around her, but not on her. She stood in a small, dry circle in the middle of the highway, as if the water didn't dare touch her. We drove another 50 miles before daring to stop at a gas station. Neither of us spoke a word the entire time. Jason was trembling, although it was warm in the cab, and I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. At the gas station, we called the police and reported what we had seen. The officer listened to us with a skeptical expression, but still sent a patrol to check that section of road. Later we learned that the patrol found no one, although they drove the entire road back and forth. A week later, when I finally mustered the courage to search for information about that accident, I learned that among the victims was a college student who was returning from an excursion with others. Her photo was in the local newspaper. It was her, the same girl we saw on the road that rainy night. I've driven that route many times since, but I always choose a different path when I have to pass by that place. Jason refused those routes altogether. He says he still sees her in his dreams, standing in the rain that can't wet her, smiling her eerie smile. Sometimes late at night, when I'm driving on an empty road and rain is tapping on the roof of my truck, I can't help but think about her. And I always check my rearview mirrors more often than necessary, because the worst thing that could happen is seeing a pale face with black eyes looking at you from the back seat with that horrible smile. My name is Jackson, and this story was told to me by my late grandfather. It was something terrifying that happened to him and his buddy while they were driving their semi-truck through the Appalachian Mountains back in the 70s. This happened many years ago, but Grandpa would tell this story at every family gathering. The event left him so shaken and disturbed that it took him several years to fully recover. He said they were casually chatting while driving late into the night. He couldn't remember the exact time. The mountain road was pitch black, illuminated only by the truck's headlights cutting through the darkness. Suddenly, they entered a stretch where it was pouring rain with incredible force. This struck them as odd because they always checked the weather conditions before hitting the road, and there was no forecast for rain in that region. But weather in the mountains is unpredictable, so they proceeded slowly and with extreme caution. All of a sudden, my grandfather noticed his buddy's demeanor change dramatically. One minute he was laughing and talking nonstop, and the next, his expression shifted completely. He began frantically telling my grandfather, who was driving, that he urgently needed to use the bathroom, and begged him to pull over somewhere so he could quickly step out. My grandfather explained that stopping was impossible. They were in an area with steep cliffs on one side and a sheer drop on the other. There was nowhere safe to pull over, and the rain was coming down so hard that it would be dangerous for anyone to step outside. There was also the risk of another vehicle coming around the bend and not being able to stop in time on the wet road. Grandpa told his friend to hold on until they cleared that treacherous section and the downpour eased up a bit. But his friend became increasingly desperate, practically begging my grandfather to stop the truck anywhere possible, saying he couldn't hold it any longer and pleading for him to pull over somewhere, anywhere. Grandpa was growing irritated with the persistent demands, as if his friend couldn't comprehend the danger of the situation. Even while ignoring his friend's pleas, my grandfather was becoming uncomfortable with his insistence, not understanding why his mood had changed so abruptly. When they finally exited that stretch of road, the rain had lightened somewhat, and Grandpa pulled the 18-wheeler onto the shoulder so his friend could finally relieve himself. However, he was completely taken aback when his buddy asked him to come along. Grandpa joked with a few choice words and told his friend to go alone, as if he'd actually leave him there. But seeing the genuine fear in his friend's expression, he decided to step out with him. He recounted that when they climbed down, his friend pulled him away from the truck and whispered that there had been someone else in the cab the entire time. This presence had been watching them through the rearview mirror, sitting directly behind my grandfather, which was why he couldn't see it. His friend described it as a shadowy silhouette with enormous eyes and an unnaturally wide, gleaming white smile that had been observing them the whole time. My grandfather, entirely skeptical, simply laughed in his face and headed back to the truck to investigate, thinking his friend was playing some elaborate prank. But when he climbed the steps to enter the passenger side, he discovered muddy footprints. Grandpa said they resembled tracks left by some enormous bird, about the size of a turkey vulture. Upon entering the truck, he immediately switched on the light and found something like ashes scattered across the entire sleeper berth. This was inexplicable because when they had started their journey, everything had been spotlessly clean, and the sheets on the bed were crisp white as always. He called to his friend that it was safe to come back. There was nobody there. However, he showed him the footprints and the mysterious ash that covered the area. Both men were terrified, but continued their journey nonetheless. When they reached their destination, as dawn was breaking, his friend, who occasionally borrowed the truck for his own hauling jobs, confessed something he hadn't mentioned out of embarrassment. The previous week, when my grandfather had lent him the truck, he had picked up a hitchhiker, a woman who claimed to be a route worker from deep in the Ozarks. The woman had demanded an exorbitant sum of money when he dropped her off, and when he refused to pay, she threatened him, saying something terrible would happen to him. He had dismissed her warnings at the time. My grandfather was deeply disturbed. On one hand, he was angry at what his friend had done with his truck. On the other hand, he wasn't sure if he believed in such things, but he couldn't explain what had happened to them that night. Perhaps the woman had mistakenly thought the truck belonged to his friend and had placed some kind of curse on it. Despite his skepticism, Grandpa sought out a local preacher he knew and had the truck blessed. Nothing unusual happened after that, at least not in the truck. However, his friend later told him that he began experiencing frightening phenomena at home. He would see shadowy figures lurking in the corners of his house and felt unexplainable chills that wouldn't subside. Many nights he would wake suddenly with indescribable terror gripping him. But that wasn't all. 3 months later, something even more disturbing occurred. His friend fell severely ill without any warning signs, and within a week, he passed away. This doesn't necessarily mean the route worker was responsible, but it was extraordinarily strange and coincidental, especially since his friend was only 45 years old and had always been in excellent health. It's something we'll never fully understand, but I'll leave it for you to decide what really happened on that stormy mountain road in the dead of night. I can finally share this story with all of you. I should clarify that it isn't mine. It belongs to my father, who was a long-haul trucker before retiring a few years back. I remember the day he came home, looking deeply shaken. We hadn't heard from him in almost a week, which wasn't unusual given his cross-country routes that often kept him away from home for extended periods. My sister and I rushed to embrace him as always, but my mother immediately sensed something was off. "How was the trip?" she asked, studying his troubled expression. "And what's got you looking like you've seen a ghost?" That's when he told us. The outbound journey had been smooth sailing, but something happened on his return that he still couldn't rationalize. He explained that he was driving down Route 17, heading back from Portland to Denver on a crisp autumn night in 2008. The mountains were shadowy silhouettes against a moonless sky when he noticed headlights in his rearview mirror. A semi-truck was following unusually close behind him. Dad was pulling a double trailer loaded with electronics, while the truck behind had a single refrigerated unit. He flashed his lights, signaling for the driver to pass. But instead, the truck behind started blaring its horn repeatedly. I tried to speed up, Dad told us, his voice still unsteady as he recounted the tale, thinking maybe he needed to get somewhere in a hurry. But no matter how I adjusted my speed, this truck kept pace exactly, refusing to pass. What confused him most was why the other driver wouldn't overtake him. This stretch of Route 17 was recently expanded to 3 lanes in each direction, and there was virtually no traffic that night, just the two of them on that lonely mountain pass. I did everything I could think of, he continued. I slowed down to 45, then sped up to 75. I flashed my lights. I even tried radioing to see if I could make contact. Nothing worked. This truck just stayed alongside me, matching my every move. The situation became increasingly dangerous as they approached Widow's Curve, a notorious hairpin turn with a 1,000-foot drop on the outer edge. No guardrail had ever been installed there, because the mountain face was too unstable for proper anchoring. Local drivers knew to slow to 25 miles per hour there, even in perfect conditions. Dad started honking frantically as they approached the curve, knowing it was suicide to try taking it side by side. Then, just as they entered the curve, the other truck suddenly accelerated, veered right, and launched straight over the edge of the cliff. I nearly lost control myself, Dad said. I managed to stop about 50 yards past the curve and grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight from the glove compartment. I ran back to the edge, heart pounding, expecting to see flames or wreckage below. What he saw, or rather didn't see, was what truly terrified him. There was nothing there. The ravine wasn't particularly deep at that point, maybe 150 feet, and with his powerful flashlight, he could clearly see the entire area. No truck, no wreckage, no disturbed earth or broken trees. Nothing to suggest a massive vehicle had just plummeted over the edge. He stood there for several minutes, bewildered, unsure whether to call emergency services. What would he even report? Finally, he hurried back to his truck and continued driving, eager to put distance between himself and Widow's Curve. Strangely enough, other vehicles began passing him shortly after. A couple of drivers even pulled alongside to ask if he needed assistance, noticing his hazards were still flashing. He declined help, not wanting to sound like he'd lost his mind. Once he felt calm enough to use his hands-free device, he called his buddy Mac, another trucker and one of his closest friends. Dad recounted everything that had just happened, his voice still trembling. After a long silence, Mac shared something chilling. "You're not the first, Joe. I didn't believe it either until now." He explained that other drivers had reported nearly identical experiences on that same stretch of Route 17. The stories all traced back to an incident from the late 80s when two truckers, former friends turned bitter rivals, had been racing dangerously through the mountains. One of them, a driver named Carson Willis, took Widow's Curve too fast and went over the edge. His body was recovered, but strangely, parts of his truck were never found despite an extensive search. Since then, numerous drivers have reported being challenged by a phantom semi with a refrigerated trailer, Carson's signature rig, that appears on foggy or moonless nights. The ghostly truck would pace them, seemingly goading them to race before vanishing or appearing to crash at the exact spot where Carson met his end. "I always thought it was just another trucker ghost story," Mac admitted. "Something to keep newcomers on edge during their first mountain run. But now that you've seen it too." Dad told us he didn't stop anywhere after that, not even at his usual rest areas. He drove straight through, fueled by adrenaline and fear, desperate to get home to us. After an experience like that, all he wanted was to be surrounded by family. I believe in these paranormal occurrences, especially on highways and mountain passes. When you think about it, these places have witnessed countless tragedies. Some souls never find peace, and others might not even realize they've crossed over to another plane of existence. What's most unsettling isn't just what my father saw that night, it's what he felt. He swears that in the moments before the truck vanished over the edge, he caught a glimpse of the driver through the side window. He didn't mention this part until years later, but he says the other driver was smiling and gesturing for him to follow. Sometimes when I'm driving along a deserted stretch of highway at night, I find myself checking my mirrors a little more frequently than necessary. Because out there, between the lonely mileposts and faded yellow lines, the boundaries between our world and whatever lies beyond seem just a little thinner than anywhere else. I want to share this story about my father, who's been a long-haul trucker for as long as I can remember. He's always telling me about strange things that happen on the road, both paranormal and otherwise. This particular story, I believe, deserves to be heard because personally, it scared me more than any other, and it terrified my father too. More than just paranormal, it's something that could happen to anyone, because these kinds of people, these evil forces, lurk everywhere. People who practice dark magic and strange rituals. Believe it or not, my father still carries the fear that what I'm about to tell you caused him. It was back in the winter of 1997. My father was returning home after a 16-hour haul delivering industrial equipment to a mining operation in rural Montana. He had already driven about 9 of those 16 hours back. It was the dead of night, around 3 in the morning, when he came across a roadblock, not police, but a group of men who looked like they were up to no good. Dad immediately decided to turn around and take an alternate route that only he and a few other truckers knew about. It was an old logging trail that cut through dense forest, but eventually reconnected with the main highway several miles ahead. He was used to this kind of situation and always had a backup plan. The company gave strict delivery deadlines, and being late wasn't an option. So he took this shortcut I mentioned, which, in my opinion, is pretty terrifying on its own. I mean, driving into the middle of the woods, completely alone, in the pitch black of a Montana winter night. Not the smartest move. No offense to my dad, but we always scold him for putting himself in danger like that. But that's just how he is. He had made it about 2/3 of the way through the forest path when he noticed a glow in the distance. At first, he thought it might be a forest fire, but as he got closer, he realized it was too contained, a massive bonfire in a clearing just ahead. Despite his growing unease about finding such activity in the middle of nowhere at that hour, he continued driving. His initial thought was that it might be some campers or hunters trying to stay warm, because that night was bone-chillingly cold, with temperatures well below freezing. But as he drew nearer, he began to make out several figures surrounding the fire. Women. They were throwing things into the flames. At first, he couldn't quite see what they were tossing in, but as he got closer, moving slowly now, headlights dimmed, he was horrified to realize they were live animals. My father was completely terrified by what he was witnessing and stopped the truck dead in its tracks. He was torn should he turn back, retracing the entire trail and risk encountering the suspicious men at the roadblock? Or should he try to somehow get past this disturbing scene ahead? He just sat there, watching these women who, according to him, were laughing hysterically as they committed this atrocity. It was truly horrifying. They were all dressed in long white gowns that seemed to glow in the firelight, making them look almost spectral. Dad couldn't count exactly how many, but he estimates there were around 12 of them. They would celebrate each time they threw a poor living creature into the flames. Then they joined hands and began contorting their bodies in strange, macabre ways while chanting something in a language he couldn't recognize. At this point, my father decided he would barrel past them at full speed. He didn't want to turn back. But just as he stepped on the accelerator, one of them suddenly turned and looked directly at his truck. He says her face was hideous, unnaturally pale with enormous eyes that seemed to burn with fury and malevolence. Not human eyes at all. She screamed to alert the others, and suddenly all of them began sprinting toward his truck. Since he was driving an 18-wheeler loaded with cargo, he didn't have time to maneuver. He slammed the truck into reverse and backed up as fast as he dared while watching these women running after him, clearly intent on doing something terrible. He described their appearance as deeply disturbing. They appeared elderly, with gray hair flying wildly around their faces. Yet they moved with the speed and agility of young athletes despite their hunched postures. My father wasn't sure how long he'd been backing up, praying no vehicle would come behind him since reversing was so difficult, when suddenly they just stopped pursuing him. When he finally felt safe, he turned around and made his way back to the highway, having experienced the biggest scare of his life. We're certain they were witches or people performing some kind of dark ritual. And thinking about it, how many people might be doing these kinds of things during the night in deserted places? Evil truly is everywhere, and that was a lesson my father learned in the worst possible way. He never took that shortcut again. And here's the strangest part. When he mentioned this incident to other truckers who used that same trail, 3 of them had similar stories, each occurring during winter months, always around the midpoint of the trail, always involving women in white. But none of the others had seen what was being thrown into the fire. Perhaps my father was the only one who got close enough to see. To this day, nearly 30 years later, my father still refuses to drive after midnight through Montana. He'll pull over and sleep in his cab until dawn rather than risk encountering whatever evil awaits in those woods. And whenever I think about taking shortcuts through unfamiliar territory, I remember his story and decide that sometimes the longer route is the safer one. Evil doesn't just exist in horror movies or ghost stories. Sometimes it's gathered around a bonfire in the middle of nowhere, waiting for unfortunate travelers to stumble upon its midnight rituals. My name is Carl, and I've been a long-haul trucker for more than 15 years, crossing the vast highways of America with heavy loads. I've always loved the freedom of the open road and the tranquility of driving through the night. But that particular journey changed everything for me. It was a dark and foggy night in the mountains of Colorado. I was returning home after a lengthy delivery, exhausted with my mind already focused on getting home to rest. The highway was deserted, just me, and the gentle swirling of the fog against my windshield. As I navigated a sharp bend, something caught my eye. A figure stood at the roadside, becoming visible in the glow of my headlights. At first, I thought it was just another stranded driver, maybe a fellow trucker with mechanical troubles. I slowed down to better assess the situation. When I switched to high beams, I could see the figure more clearly. It resembled an angel with enormous wings, but they were broken, hanging unnaturally around its body. Its appearance was haunting and pallid, as if it had emerged from a nightmare. The figure raised one hand, signaling for help. I felt conflicted. As an experienced trucker, I'd always believed in helping those stranded on the highways. But something about this vision left me deeply unsettled. Maybe it was fatigue or fear of the unknown, but I hesitated to stop. Even so, I couldn't just leave someone or something in that state alone in the fog. I reduced my speed even further, but something inside me screamed to keep driving and leave that scene behind. As I drew closer, I noticed the figure didn't move. It just remained stationary with an expression that seemed a mixture of pain and pleading. Its wings were visibly damaged, twisted in an unnatural way, and I began to feel chills running up my spine. That's when something strange happened. The figure opened its mouth and released a cry that sounded more like a lament, echoing across the empty highway. The intensity of the sound made me instinctively hit the accelerator, leaving the figure behind on the road. My heart was racing, and my hands were sweating as I drove rapidly, trying to distance myself from that disturbing scene. I couldn't get the image of the figure out of my mind. The silence was oppressive, and the darkness seemed heavier now. Despite having left the figure behind, the feeling of dread remained. I tried to calm myself, remembering that it could have been just a nightmare or a hallucination caused by exhaustion. But part of me knew something very strange was happening that night. After leaving the figure behind, I continued driving hastily, trying to get away from that disturbing encounter as quickly as possible. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and I could feel the weight of the night surrounding me. But then something unexpected happened. Suddenly, the lights of my truck began to flicker and fail, leaving the road even darker than before. My attempts to turn the headlights back on didn't work, and I could barely see ahead. I was essentially driving blind, trying to keep the truck on the road. As I rounded a curve, I spotted a figure in the middle of the highway, the exact same figure I had seen before. I tried to swerve, but lost control of the truck, which veered off the road and crashed hard into a pine tree at the roadside. The collision was severe, but I was wearing my seat belt and fortunately wasn't seriously injured. When I recovered from the shock, I exited the truck and looked around, but saw no sign of the figure that had appeared in the middle of the road. Shaking and frightened, I began walking along the highway, hoping to find help. Sometime later, I was rescued by a passing motorist and taken to the hospital for medical attention. After the accident, I heard stories from other drivers who had also seen the figure of the angel with broken wings on the highway and suffered accidents similar to mine. What worried me most was discovering that none of the drivers who had stopped to help the figure had survived. I've avoided that stretch of highway ever since, and the fear from that encounter still haunts me at night. Many locals believe the highway angel is a curse, a vengeful entity seeking retribution on those who cross its path. Although I can't explain exactly what happened that night, I know I was one of the lucky few to escape with my life. My name is Lewis. I'm a trucker who spends a lot of time on America's highways, especially in the more remote and deserted regions of the Southwest. I've always heard rumors and legends about the three sisters, three ghostly women who appear on dark nights, asking for rides from unsuspecting drivers. The stories say they appear suddenly, always in groups of three, wearing white dresses with long hair. Some say the sisters have empty gazes and haunted expressions, while others claim they ask for help with whispering voices. Many road colleagues have told me frightening stories about this, but I always thought they were just rumors or inventions to scare people. After all, I've seen many strange things on the highways, but never experienced anything like these three sisters. The accounts vary, but everyone agrees on one thing. Whoever stops to help the three sisters is never seen again. This always made me cautious, and I learned to be careful when driving on highways at night. Despite this, curiosity was always present. What happens to those who stop to help? Are they just legends, or is there really something supernatural involving these sisters? These questions always accompanied me, but I never had the courage to try to discover the truth on my own. One night, I was driving my truck on a highway through a deserted region of Arizona. It was a cloudy night with no moon or visible stars, making the road even darker and quieter than usual. I was beginning to feel the fatigue of a long day's work, when suddenly I spotted something strange ahead. Three figures were standing by the roadside, apparently hitchhiking. As I approached, I realized they were women in white dresses, and I immediately knew who they were, the three sisters. My heart raced as I saw those shadowy figures and their empty expressions. They waved to me, asking for a ride, but remembering the stories, I decided to continue driving without stopping. I kept my eyes fixed on the road and took deep breaths to stay calm. In the rearview mirror, I could see the three sisters watching as I drove away. The stories said they could disappear as quickly as they appeared, but at that moment, I didn't care to look back. I continued driving, trying to push the images of the three sisters from my mind. But the shock was significant. I never imagined I would actually encounter the ghost sisters on the highway. After continuing to drive for some time, I thought I had left the three sisters behind. I tried to focus on driving and stay calm, but something felt wrong. The air was heavy with a sense of tension, as if I were being watched. Suddenly, to my horror, I spotted the three sisters again, further ahead on the road. They were standing beside the highway, in the direction I was heading. The shock was immense, because it made no sense for them to be there after I had driven so far. They still wore their white dresses, with loose hair and expressionless faces. The three sisters waved insistently for me to stop the truck. The atmosphere became even more sinister when I realized that the silence around me was absolute, as if the whole world had stopped. I knew I shouldn't stop, so I reduced speed just enough to pass them cautiously. I tried not to look directly at the sisters as I passed, but it was difficult not to feel their disturbing presence. As soon as I left them behind again, I accelerated the truck, trying to distance myself from them as much as possible. The fear was great, and the tense atmosphere made each mile seem longer than it really was. I didn't know if they would reappear again, so I remained alert, driving carefully and trying to stay awake to avoid any incidents on the road. The three sisters appeared on the road again, staring at me with their empty gazes. Even with fear dominating my thoughts, I decided to stop the truck to see what was happening. I thought that perhaps confronting them head-on might end it once and for all. I parked the truck beside the road and turned off the engine, silence taking over the environment. The sisters remained standing with outstretched hands, as if waiting for me to exit the vehicle. I decided to open the door and get out, even with my racing heart and heavy breathing. I slowly approached the three figures, but they didn't move. When I got closer, I noticed their eyes were dark and lifeless, as if they were looking directly into my soul. Suddenly, the three sisters began to murmur something in a language I couldn't understand. The atmosphere became even more somber, and I felt an intense chill run through my body. As the sisters murmured, I felt a heaviness in the air, a sinister presence that seemed to drain my energy. Before I could react, the three sisters suddenly disappeared in a cloud of mist. I was left alone on the highway, confused and shaken by what had just happened. I quickly returned to the truck and closed the door, trying to regain my composure. The situation had become even more frightening, and I wanted to leave. I started the truck and accelerated, leaving that nightmare behind. The sensation of having been marked by something supernatural didn't abandon me. I drove with trembling hands, trying to distance myself as much as possible from that cursed place. The headlights seemed to illuminate little of the road ahead, but I didn't want to slow down. I just wanted to get out of there. The murmurs of the three sisters still echoed in my mind, and that feeling of having been marked by the encounter with them wouldn't leave me in peace. As I drove, I tried to concentrate on the asphalt ahead and on heading toward the nearest town. After a few minutes, I allowed myself to look in the rearview mirror. To my surprise and relief, there was no sign of the three sisters. However, whatever they had done or said still haunted me. Finally, I spotted the entrance to a small town and felt immense relief as I passed through the portal of lights and saw people on the streets. I stopped at a gas station to breathe and recover. I needed a few minutes to calm down and understand that I had survived that terrible night. I talked with some truckers at the station, but nobody seemed to believe my story. They laughed at me and said I must have been too tired or that I had been daydreaming. I left there with a mixture of relief and unease, unable to fully understand what had happened. One thing was certain: that encounter changed my view of the highways forever. My name is Jack, and I was driving my truck along deserted roads one summer night when /content. I've driven through the Nevada desert countless times, but there's something about Route 19 that always keeps me guessing, especially after sunset, when the vast emptiness seems to come alive with shadows. That particular evening, I was hauling a load of electronics from Vegas to Salt Lake City. The summer heat had finally given way to a cool autumn night, and my old Peterbilt was eating up the miles under a moonless sky. The radio had long since faded to static, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the rhythmic hum of tires on asphalt. It started with a slight hesitation in the engine, nothing dramatic, just enough for a veteran driver like myself to notice. I pressed the accelerator, But instead of the usual surge of power, the truck coughed and sputtered like it was gasping for breath. Within seconds, the dashboard lights began to flicker, and I knew I had to pull over before I lost power completely. I eased the rig onto the shoulder and cut the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet you only find in places far removed from civilization. I stepped out of the cab, and the cold desert air hit me like a slap. The temperature drops fast in these parts once the sun goes down, and I could already see my breath forming small clouds in front of my face. Grabbing my heavy-duty flashlight from the glove compartment, I popped the hood and started examining the engine. After 15 years on the road, I've learned a thing or two about keeping these beasts running, even if I'm no certified mechanic. I suspected it might be the alternator, or perhaps a loose connection somewhere in the electrical system. As I leaned in, adjusting wires and checking connections, a strange feeling crept over me, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. I straightened up and swept my flashlight beam across the empty highway and the vast expanse of desert scrub. Nothing but sagebrush and shadows stretching to the horizon. "Get it together, Mike," I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease. The desert plays tricks on your mind. Every trucker knows that. I forced my attention back to the engine, but that crawling sensation between my shoulder blades wouldn't subside. Then came a sound, faint but distinct, like footsteps crunching on gravel, somewhere behind the truck. I spun around, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest, and aimed the flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the night, but revealed nothing unusual. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small against the vastness of the desert. No response, just that eerie silence again. I tried to convince myself it was just a coyote or maybe the wind moving the brush, but deep down, I knew it was something else. Something was out there, watching me from just beyond the reach of my light. I returned to the engine with renewed urgency, my fingers working faster now, checking connections and testing the battery terminals. The cold was intensifying, seeping through my jacket and numbing my fingers. I needed to get this truck running and get the hell away from here. Just as I reconnected a loose wire, I felt it, a rush of frigid air brushing past me, as if someone had walked right by. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and I whirled around so fast I nearly lost my balance. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking slightly. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand as I scanned the surroundings. Still nothing. I decided to retrieve my phone from the cab, thinking I might be able to call for roadside assistance. But as expected, there wasn't a single bar of reception out here. Route 19 was notorious for its dead zones, one of the reasons many truckers avoided it at night. The isolation hit me hard then. I was at least 70 miles from the nearest town, and traffic on this stretch was almost non-existent after dark. If something happened to me out here, it might be days before anyone found me. I returned to the engine with grim determination. The mysterious presence seemed to grow stronger, not just a feeling anymore, but almost tangible, like someone breathing down my neck. I worked frantically, checking the fuel lines, the spark plugs, anything that might get me moving again. A loud snap echoed through the night, like a branch breaking underfoot, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, and swept the flashlight across the desert in wide, panicked arcs. "I know someone's out there," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Show yourself," only silence answered me. Was I losing my mind? Was the loneliness of the road finally getting to me after all these years? I'd heard stories from other truckers, tales of hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and isolation. But this felt real, too real. With shaking hands, I made one final adjustment to the engine, praying it would be enough. I climbed back into the cab, locked the doors, and turned the key. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared to life. I've never been so grateful to hear that rumbling sound. Before pulling back onto the highway, I looked in my mirrors and out the windows one last time. The desert appeared empty and innocent under the starlight, betraying nothing of what I'd just experienced. As I accelerated down the highway, watching the speedometer climb past 40, then 50, then 60 miles per hour, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been watching me was now following. Every few minutes I checked my mirrors, half expecting to see something or someone in pursuit. The further I drove, the more I tried to rationalize what had happened. Exhaustion, stress, an overactive imagination, fueled by too many late-night horror movies. All perfectly logical explanations. But logic offered little comfort as I sped through the night, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. After about an hour of driving, the lights of a small town appeared on the horizon like a mirage. Junction Creek. Population 817, according to the weather-beaten sign that welcomed me. I pulled into an all-night truck stop, where the fluorescent lights and sounds of other people felt like salvation. I sat in the diner section, warming my hands around a mug of coffee, trying to make sense of what had happened back there on Route 19. A few other truckers nodded hello, and I considered sharing my experience, but stopped myself. Some stories are better left untold, especially when you can't explain them yourself. One thing's for certain, though I've changed my route since then. These days, I take the longer interstate that adds 2 hours to my journey, but keeps me well away from that stretch of desert highway. Some might call it superstition, but when you felt what I felt that night, you don't take chances. Sometimes, when I'm driving late and the road ahead stretches empty before me, I still check my mirrors more often than necessary. And sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I can still feel those eyes watching me from somewhere in the darkness. My name is Mark. I've been driving big rigs across America for 15 years now, and I've grown accustomed to those long, lonely nights on the road. But what happened to me back in the summer of 1997 still gives me chills whenever I think about it. I was hauling a load from Chicago to Phoenix along the old Route 66. It was one of those perfect desert nights. Cool air flowing through the half-open window, a full moon hanging low in the sky, and stars scattered across the darkness like diamonds on black velvet. The dashboard lights cast a soft blue glow across the cabin, just enough to keep me company. I hadn't seen another vehicle for at least 2 hours. This stretch of highway cuts through some of the most isolated parts of the Southwest. And at 3 in the morning, it feels like you're the last person on Earth. Usually, I enjoy that solitude. I'd crank up some Merle Haggard or Johnny Cash on the tape deck, sip my coffee, and watched the white lines disappear beneath my wheels. That night should have been just like any other, nothing special. Just me and 18 wheels eating up the miles. I was making good time, hoping to get through Flagstaff before sunrise when the desert heat starts building up. I remember checking my mirrors and noticing something odd. At first, I thought it was just road fatigue playing tricks on my eyes. A shadow moving alongside my truck. Not behind it or in front, but right beside the cab, keeping perfect pace at 70 miles per hour. I rubbed my eyes and took another swig of lukewarm coffee from my thermos. The shadow was still there, floating as if gravity didn't apply to it. It had no source that I could see, no vehicle casting it, no clouds passing overhead in front of the moon. Just this dark silhouette gliding along the asphalt beside me. "You're seeing things, Mark," I said aloud, my voice sounding strange in the quiet cab. Time for another coffee break, but I didn't stop. Something kept my foot on the gas pedal, my eyes flicking between the road ahead and that strange shadow dancing at the edge of my vision. I turned up the radio, hoping to drown out my thoughts, but all I got was static. Not even the usual late-night talk shows that normally keep me company through the empty hours. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The shadow never left. When I accelerated to 80, it matched my speed effortlessly. When I slowed to 50, it remained right there beside me. I flicked on my high beams, illuminating the desert scrub and cacti that lined the roadside. But the shadow didn't disappear or change shape. It remained a featureless silhouette, like a cutout of a person that someone had forgotten to fill in. The worst part, it seemed to be getting closer, inch by inch, as if testing how near it could get before I noticed. I did notice, and I was terrified. My knuckles turned white against the steering wheel. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool night air. In all my years on the road, through blizzards in the Rockies, floods in the Midwest, and even a tornado scare in Oklahoma, I'd never felt fear like this before. I'm not a superstitious man, never put much stock in ghost stories. But out there, alone on Route 66 with nothing but desert for miles around, rational thought starts to slip away like sand through your fingers. Then something happened that nearly sent me off the road. The CB radio, which had been silent all night, crackled to life with a burst of static. Through the white noise came a voice, distant and distorted, like someone speaking through water. "You see it too." I nearly jumped out of my skin. My hand hovered over the radio, trembling slightly before I picked up the receiver. "Who's out there?" I asked, my voice cracking. No response, just more static, then silence. I glanced back at the shadow. Was it waving at me? The formless shape seemed to ripple, as if acknowledging that I'd finally engaged with it. The next hour was the longest of my life. The shadow stayed with me, sometimes drawing closer to the truck, sometimes drifting further away, but always there. The radio remained dead silent after that single, cryptic transmission. I tried everything to make sense of it. I even pulled over once, hands shaking as I stepped down from the cab with my flashlight. I swept the beam across the roadside, illuminating nothing but desert plants and rocks. But the moment I climbed back in and started moving, the shadow reappeared, as if it had been waiting patiently for me to continue our strange journey together. As I crossed into Arizona, the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Pale blues and pinks pushed back against the night, and as they did, I noticed something changing. The shadow that had been my unwanted companion through the darkest hours began to fade. It didn't disappear all at once, but gradually thinned like morning mist, becoming transparent as sunlight strengthened. By the time the sun crested the horizon, painting the desert in gold and orange, the shadow was gone completely. The highway stretched out before me, empty and ordinary in the morning light. I pulled into the first truck stop I found and sat there for a long while, engine off, just breathing. The other drivers moving around the lot, filling their thermoses with coffee and exchanging road stories, had no idea what I just experienced. Later that day, when I delivered my load in Phoenix, I asked some of the local drivers if they'd ever experienced anything strange on that stretch of Route 66. One old-timer looked at me for a long moment before answering. "That part of the desert," he said quietly, "that's Navajo land. Old stories say there are skinwalkers out there, spirits that follow travelers, especially at night." He shrugged. "But that's just talk, right? Just old stories. I never drove that stretch of highway at night again. I rearranged my routes, made excuses to dispatchers, even took pay cuts to avoid it. Some might call it superstition. Others might say I let my imagination run wild that night. But 26 years later, I still check my mirrors more often than I need to. And sometimes, just as the sun goes down and shadows begin to lengthen across the asphalt, I swear I can feel something watching me, waiting for the right moment to return. And the strangest thing, last week while passing through a truck stop in New Mexico, my CB crackled to life in the middle of the night. Through the static, I heard those same 4 words, "You see it too." I didn't answer. Some questions are better left unanswered on the long, dark road. I had just picked up a load in Chicago, destined for a new boutique in downtown Boston. The warehouse worker, a tall man with a piercing gaze, informed me they were mannequins. Normally, this wouldn't bother me, as in my career as a long-haul trucker, I've transported everything from electronics to antique furniture, and even shipments I preferred not to know the contents of. I checked the delivery manifest and counted each mannequin as they were loaded onto the truck. There were 27 pieces in total, all packaged in cardboard boxes with bubble wrap and secured with adhesive tape. Each box was carefully labeled, indicating specific body parts or complete mannequins. After loading, I took one final look to ensure the cargo was securely fastened. Previous experiences had taught me that a poorly secured container could result in damaged merchandise, something I wanted to avoid at all costs. Besides, with sleet forecast to fall during the night, it was essential to ensure nothing would get wet. After closing the container, I climbed into the truck's cabin and started the engine, feeling the familiar rumble of diesel bringing the vehicle to life. I began my journey late in the evening, watching the city lights slowly illuminate as twilight gave way to night. I was eager to deliver these mannequins and finish the job. There was something about mannequins that always made me uncomfortable. Perhaps it was the way they seemed to observe everything with their hollow eyes, or how the light sometimes cast strange shadows on their expressionless faces. Either way, I was ready to get rid of this cargo as quickly as possible. With the destination address programmed into the GPS and a long night of driving ahead, I tuned the radio to a country music station, settled into my seat, and headed onto Interstate 90 that cut through the nocturnal landscape toward New England. The journey was smooth, with little traffic and a starry night above. The road, illuminated only by the truck's headlights, stretched before me like a river of dark asphalt. I had planned to make just one stop for coffee and to stretch my legs, but life, as always, had other plans. It was almost midnight when the first wet snowflakes began to fall, signaling the start of a storm that promised to be severe. I increased the speed of the windshield wipers and reduced the truck's speed, maintaining a safe distance from the few vehicles sharing the road with me. The country music playing on the radio was now mixed with traffic bulletins and weather alerts. That's when I first heard the sound, low, almost muffled, as if something was lightly tapping from inside the container. At first, I thought it was the effect of the heavy sleet on the metal, or perhaps some equipment that hadn't been properly secured. But as the precipitation lessened, the sound persisted, becoming more distinct now, like deliberate knocks. Must be something that came loose, I muttered to myself, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. I decided I would stop at the next gas station to check the cargo. I didn't want to risk damaging the mannequins or having the load come completely loose. When I finally stopped, the clock showed almost 2 in the morning. The gas station was practically empty, illuminated by fluorescent lights that gave the place a ghostly appearance. I turned off the engine and grabbed my flashlight. The sound of my boots on the wet asphalt echoed in the silence of the night. I opened the container with a sense of hesitation. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the boxes of mannequins seemingly just as I had left them. For a moment, I thought I had worried for nothing. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, the sound of something knocking coming from the back of the container. My heart raced as I walked between the boxes, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. When I reached the end of the container, I stopped abruptly. It wasn't the boxes making the noise. It was something or someone knocking from inside one of them. My first instinct was to back away. My heart pounded heavily in my chest, while my mind tried to process what was happening. Something inside one of the boxes was moving, hitting the cardboard walls with enough force to be heard inside the container. I swallowed hard, my hand firm on the flashlight, trying to illuminate every dark corner in front of me. I cautiously approached the box from which the sounds were coming. It was slightly set apart from the others, hidden behind some larger ones. The label was turned downward, making it impossible to see what it was supposed to contain. With a trembling breath, I pulled the box to a more illuminated space and, using a pocket knife, cut the tape binding it. The noise stopped as soon as I placed my hand on the lid. A heavy silence fell over the container, so dense I could feel its weight. Slowly, I lifted the lid and looked inside, expecting to find something, perhaps an animal that had accidentally gotten trapped. But there was nothing like that. Instead, I saw one of the mannequins, but not like the others I was transporting. This one looked different. Its eyes were open, very open, and there was an expression on its face that seemed like fear, almost human. It looked like it was trying to escape from the position in which it had been placed. I stepped back, my breath caught in my throat. It didn't make sense. Mannequins don't change expressions. They don't have emotions. But the light from my flashlight clearly revealed the terror on its face. Not wanting to stay there a second longer, I quickly closed the lid and pushed the box back to its place. My entire body was shaking as I closed the container and locked the padlock with more force than necessary. I returned to the truck's cabin, trying to push away thoughts of what I had seen. I started the engine and left the gas station as quickly as possible. I needed to put some distance between myself and that cargo, at least until I could deliver everything to Boston and forget what had happened. But as I drove down the snowy road, something else began to trouble me. I hadn't noticed it immediately because of the snowfall, but now that it had weakened, I could see it clearly in the rearview mirror. A thin line of dark traces trailing from my container, as if something inside was slowly seeping out. And another sound, not knocking, but something else. A quiet, almost inaudible whisper that seemed to grow louder with each mile passed. A whisper that sounded like my name. The road to Boston now seemed endless, and I felt that with each mile, I was moving away not only from Chicago, but from the safety of the real world, which I might never see again. In my mind, I was already promising myself that this would be my last assignment in this job. The last cargo, if I ever made it to Boston at all. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.